What's up, guys? Justin here, and welcome to my starts and sits for week 14 of NFL Fantasy Football. This is likely the final week of your regular season, so let's get those must wins and get into the playoffs. Let's jump right in and start it off with quarterbacks I'd want in my lineups this week. Jordan Love is coming off a 4-touchdown performance on Thanksgiving, and I want him in my lineup this week against the Chicago Bears. The Bears give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing QBs, which is right under 20 points per game. The Bears are also in the bottom 10 in terms of pass defense DVOA, and PFF ranks their pass rush in the bottom 5 of the entire NFL, and this should benefit Jordan Love and the passing game. Daniel Jones has not had a top 12 finish since week 8, though he has had some more challenging opponents in that stretch. I'm a bit concerned with his injury, but he still managed 16 points against a tough Texans defense last week. And this week, he gets the Jaguars, who give up the 10th most fantasy points to the position. I thought Bo Nix was going to have a top 12 finish last week, but a couple of goal line RJ Harvey touchdowns kept that from happening. Nix gets a solid matchup again this week against the Raiders. Las Vegas has the second worst PFF coverage grade in the entire NFL and is bottom 10 in EPA allowed on passing plays. They also give up around 17.5 fantasy points per game, which is the 14th most. I don't know how you can think about starting JJ McCarthy right now, but if he clears concussion protocol, he draws an extremely enticing matchup against the Commanders. Washington gives up the most EPA on passing plays in the league, and they also have the worst PFF coverage grade and give up the 8th most fantasy points to the position. It is an extremely risky start, but maybe it pays off. And let's look at the quarterbacks that I'm sitting this week. Patrick Mahomes has 3 finishes outside the top 12 so far this season, with 2 of those being against the Bills and the Broncos, who give up the 3rd and 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, respectively. And this week, Mahomes gets the Texans, who are the best in the league against fantasy quarterbacks. Plus, Houston has the best pass defense DVOA, PFF coverage grade, and EPA allowed in the entire NFL. I think you can sit Mahomes this week in search of a top 12 QB. Caleb Williams is getting a sit from me this week against the Green Bay Packers. The Packers are the 7th best against quarterbacks in fantasy football and have top 4 PFF coverage and pass rush grades. In similar matchups recently, Caleb finished as the QB 22 and QB 25 against the Vikings and the Eagles, respectively. Since week 6, Jacoby Brissett has been the QB 5 with a top 12 finish in every single game, and he's the QB 4 if you exclude Jameis Winston's 2 starts. However, this week, he gets the Los Angeles Rams, who are top 3 in pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed. The Rams also give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Jacoby, you were great this year, but it is time to rest. And this also applies to Kyler Murray if he is activated and starts. You probably don't want to be starting Cam Ward or Geno Smith anyway, but I have to mention this as these guys draw matchups against the teams who allow the 4th and 5th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, those being the Browns and the Broncos. Let's move over to running back and start it off with my starts. Chase Brown is likely a must-start at this point in the season, coming off 5 straight top 13 finishes, but I need to mention him in this video because of his great matchup against the Bills. The Bills have a bottom 5 rushing defense in terms of DVOA and EPA allowed, and give up the 3rd most points to running backs. So go ahead and start Brown with confidence once again. As of writing this, I don't know who will be the starting running back for the Vikings, but whoever it is, go ahead and start him. The Commanders give up the 4th most fantasy points to the position and are bottom 10 in PFF run defense grade. The Vikings will likely run a lot regardless of who their quarterback is too, so this is a great matchup for this running back room. I don't think you need me to tell you to start Bucky Irving this week, but in an extremely shallow league, I benched him last week because I was nervous about his usage. He did only play 54% of snaps, but he saw almost 80% of the rushing work. This week, he gets the Falcons, who allow the 9th most fantasy points to opposing running backs and sit in the bottom 10 in terms of PFF run defense grade and EPA allowed. Quinshon Judkins is a must start for me this week as he gets the Titans, who allow the 11th most fantasy points to running backs. The Titans are also bottom 6 or 7 in terms of rush defense DVOA. Plus, Dylan Sampson did not practice on Wednesday and he may miss this week. If Judkins can get more involved in the passing game, like he did last week, this can lead to a big-time performance for the rookie. RJ Harvey was one of my favorite starts last week, and he put up the RB2 performance. Now, this was heavily due to his 2 goal line touchdowns, but I think he should be able to find the end zone again against a bad Raiders defense. They are in the bottom half of points given up to the position and are in the bottom 10 in terms of PFF run defense grade. This backfield is still split, but I am not concerned about that this week. So now let's move over to the running backs that I'm sitting this week. Ashton Genty has not averaged over 3.5 yards per carry since week 5. but he stayed fantasy relevant due to his work in the passing game, catching 5 or more passes in 4 out of his last 5 games. But I am sitting him this week against the Broncos. Denver allows the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs. Genty could produce in the passing game once again, but if you have better options, I'd be looking at them instead. I am sitting both Cardinals running backs this week, those being Bam Knight and Michael Carter. The Rams give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the position, and they have overtaken the Browns as the team with the league's best PFF run defense grade. LA also has the 3rd best rush defense DVOA, so an extremely tough matchup for this split running back room. I'm sitting both of the Texans running backs this week, even if Woody Marks were to miss. The usage has been there for Woody, but he is only getting rushing yards. He's had 1 catch in each of the last 3 games, getting a total of 5 yards. And Nick Chubb is just old and washed at this point, so I don't even need to get into that. The Chiefs are the 6th best against the position in terms of fantasy football and are also in the top half of the league in terms of rush defense DVOA and PFF run defense grade. On the flip side of this game, I'm sitting the Chiefs running backs too. Houston is top 5 in run defense DVOA and PFF run defense grade, and also are in the top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to running backs, so go ahead and sit Hunt and Pacheco. Tony Pollard seems to find himself on this list every single week. The Titans' offense has not been good, which causes Pollard to be inefficient with his touches, and he seems to draw terrible matchups week after week. This week, he gets the Browns, who will allow the 8th fewest fantasy points to the position and hold the league's best EPA allowed on rushing plays. They're still likely the best run defense in the entire NFL. Now let's head over to the wide receivers that I'm starting this week. Zay Flowers hasn't had a finish better than a wide receiver 23 since week 1, but he has seen at least 5 targets in every game this season except 1. This is the perfect week to get back into the top 20, as he draws the Steelers, who allow the 2nd most fantasy points to wide receivers. He's earning 28% of targets, with the next closest receiver only earning 12%, so this is a great spot for Zay. I told you to sit Justin Jefferson last week, and it worked out. Like JJ McCarthy, he and Jordan Addison draw an exceptional matchup against the Washington Commanders, who allow the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wideouts. It's tough to start this passing offense, but this is just about the best matchup that they can get. Hopefully your season doesn't rely on it, but I am starting these guys this week. I think you can start each of the Broncos wide receivers too. Courtland Sutton, Troy Franklin, even coming off a down game, and a sleeper start is Pat Bryant. Bryant has seen the 2nd most targets among all Broncos pass catchers in their last 2 games. This unit gets the Raiders, who allow the 6th most fantasy points to the position, and the Raiders also have the 2nd worst PFF coverage grade in the entire league. Jacoby Myers is getting a start from me, and you could probably include Brian Thomas in that too. The Colts are bottom 10 against the wide receiver position in fantasy football, and since Jacoby Myers' first game in Jacksonville, he has led the team in target share. It would also be helpful for these 2 wideouts if Parker Washington missed this week, so pay attention to that. And like Jordan Love, Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson are getting starts from me against the Bears, who give up the 10th most fantasy points to wide receivers. As mentioned before, the Bears are bottom 10 in pass defense DVOA, and since Watson's first game in Week 8, he has commanded a 20% target share, but that's up to 31% in the last 3 weeks. He looks to be the number 1 guy in Green Bay. Next up, let's see what wide receivers I'm sitting this week. And my boldest claim of the week is to sit A.J. Brown coming off the wide receiver 1 performance in Week 13. And I want to first mention that his performance last week was kind of fluky, with a good chunk of his fantasy points coming in garbage time. Second, he draws the Chargers this week, who allow the fewest fantasy points to the position. The game total is only set at 40.5, so it should be a low-scoring game, but the defense is dominating. Xavier Worthy has seen 5 or more targets in 5 straight games, but the fantasy output isn't quite there, and I would be benching him this week against the Texans defense. Houston has the best pass defense DVOA and EPA allowed in the entire league, and they allow the 3rd fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. Terry McLaurin and Deebo Samuel both had solid fantasy days against a great Broncos defense last week, but I am sitting them again in another tough matchup against the Vikings. Minnesota is the 2nd best against fantasy wide receivers, and this game total is in the low 40s, so I expect the Vikings defense to play well this week. It might have been fun to see the Raiders trade away Jacoby Myers as a Trey Tucker owner, but I told you to try and offload him for whatever you can get, and in the past 2 weeks, he had the Browns and the Chargers, totaling 10.8 fantasy points in those games combined. And this week, he gets the Broncos, who give up the 5th fewest fantasy points to the position. And not to jump the gun, but the next 2 matchups for Tucker are the Eagles and the Texans, so just keep him on your bench until week 17. I don't expect Drake London to suit up this week, so Darnell Mooney would be the top wide receiver for the Falcons. He hasn't done much this season, and I will continue to not trust him as he gets the Seahawks in week 14. Seattle is the 8th best in the NFL against the position, and they hold the 2nd best pass defense DVOA in the league. They are also top 5 in PFF coverage grade and EPA allowed. Please find someone other than Mooney this week. And in the last position of the video, let's look at the tight ends that I'm starting. So you pretty much want to start any tight end against the Bengals, who by far and away allow the most fantasy points to the position. In fact, there is over a 5.5 point gap between them and the team who allows the second most points. So this week, if healthy, I am starting Dalton Kincaid. He's one of the only somewhat consistent pass catchers on the team, plus he gets the great matchup. So let's hope he's active this week. In his 2 games since returning from injury, Brenton Strange has seen the 2nd most targets of any Jaguar. This week, he gets the Colts, who are the 4th worst against the position. So get this possible league winner into your lineups again this week. Darren Waller is getting a start from me again this week too. He gets the Jets in week 14, but they aren't some incredible matchup for tight ends like the other guys on this list. In fact, they aren't even in the top half of the league in terms of points given up to the position. However, Waller is operating much more like a wide receiver, so his usage is high, and the Jets have the worst pass defense DVOA in the entire league. A similar thing could be said about Evan Ingram. The Raiders are actually top 3 against the position, but Evan Ingram looked like a wide receiver coming out of the Broncos' bye, so maybe they finally figured out how to use him. The Raiders have the 2nd worst PFF coverage grade in the league and are bottom 10 in EPA allowed. And finally, let's look at the tight ends that I'm sitting this week. Dallas Goedert had an extremely strong start to the 2025 season, catching 7 touchdowns in his first 7 games. However, since his bye in week 9, he hasn't found the end zone or even scored more than 9 fantasy points. I am benching him this week in a tough matchup against the Chargers, who are the 6th best against the position in all of fantasy football. Colston Loveland is finally starting to overtake Cole Kmet as the predominant Bears tight end, but I am benching him this week for the 2nd straight time. The Packers only allow about 12 fantasy points to opposing tight ends, which is good enough for 12th best in the league. Between the tough matchup and the split tight end room, I'd be looking for another option this week. And lastly, I want to point out that Oronde Gadsden, Travis Kelce, and Dalton Schultz all have tough matchups this week. I don't know if I'd ever sit these guys, but their opponents are all within the top 7 worst matchups for tight ends. Thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe and drop any questions that you have in the comments.